Hello everyone, thanks for coming to the IAAC lecture series. This is the second IAAC lecture series of the year, after the opening lecture we had a couple of weeks ago. And we have here with us today José Luis de Vicente. José Luis de Vicente is a curator, a writer, a researcher, a visionary who is investigating the intersection, the cultural intersection between technology, citizen social innovation, art and design. He's currently in a research program called Visualizar at the Medialab-Prado in Madrid, and is also the curator of the Sónar+D, who is the innovation area of the Sónar Festival. If you don't know what the Sónar is, you will discover it very soon, around June, I'm sure about that. And maybe if we are lucky enough, we will be also managed to participate to the Sónar+D section. You will love it. José Luis de Vicente is also a curator of symposium and exhibition. I will mention two of them, both of them at the CCCB. One was the Big Bang Data, an amazing exhibition that was back in 2014, and after the CCCB in Barcelona, I've been traveling in Madrid, Buenos Aires, London, Santiago de Chile, Lima, Singapore, Mexico City, Prague. So really, and now at the MIT, all over the world, exploring this phenomenon of the big data and the impact of the big data in nowadays in our lives. And again, he curated an exhibition that right now is again at the CCCB, called After the End of the World. An exhibition that opened 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, is still on. I think is very interesting for you. I don't want to anticipate too much because probably you're going to explain something about it, so I don't want to spoil it. And last but not least, José Luis de Vicente is also faculty at IAAC, at the Master in City and Technology. Actually, you don't know him yet because you're going to have the first class tomorrow, so so you will. And so this lecture also comes as a first introduction to your faculty. I would leave the show, the stage to you, so please help me welcome José Luis de Vicente at IAAC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Silvia, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It makes me really, really happy to speak here because it's a little bit like playing at home, you know, like this is a home game, which is nice for the first time that you give a talk about a project that you've been working on for 3 years, and then at this point you don't know if you are like really, really eager to speak about it or you are completely sick about the idea of speaking about it. So it's good that I can be at home deciding that. Also, hi to everybody in the Master in City and Technology. We haven't met yet, but we're meeting tomorrow. I am part of your teachers, and we will be starting tomorrow. So this was like kind of a nice prologue to speak about this project, this exhibition that, as Silvia was saying, opened 3 weeks ago at the Barcelona Center for Contemporary Culture. Now, it's kind of difficult for me to speak about it because at the same time, I want to speak about it, and I don't want to speak about it. I don't want to speak about it because I don't want to spoil it for you. This is similar to if I had been a filmmaker and I've been shooting a film for 3 years. I'm not going to come here now and spoil to you the end of the film, you know, and tell you who is who. Usually, when I get to speak about an exhibition that I've done, it's not in the context of the city where it's been born, and actually we can take the metro, and in 12 minutes you will be there, and you will be able to see it yourself. And if I wouldn't want to spoil an exhibition in this specific case, I definitely don't want to, because I'm even asking all the journalists writing about it to please not spoiling it, because there's a lot of in the exhibition that is about personal journey and a personal discovery. The only two things that I would say about it is, please don't go on Sunday evenings, because it's completely packed with people, and that is not the way to see this show. And don't go in big groups. Don't go with 15 people. Don't go with 10 people. Go alone, or go with 1 people, or 2, or maximum 3, because really the project is about personal discovery. So, if I'm not going to talk about the what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about the why, about the main things and about the main factors that convince us at CCCB, which is an art institution, well, a cultural institution that is committed to the future in different ways, that we could think about how to speak about the biggest problem that as a species we face. What would be the way of speaking about this thing that we mostly don't want to speak about? What would be a way of thinking about it so that we can transcend our current limitations on thinking about it? And what would be a way of actually getting us to face, kind of almost a little bit in a kind of a group therapy session sort of way, the big traumatic things that talking about climate change and talking about the climate crisis and the transformation of the planet involves or implies. Because one of the big questions about this topic is, if this is the most important crisis that we face as a society, why don't we speak about it every single day? Why are not all newspapers opening the headlines every day with what this involves? And why, when we speak about it, we usually don't speak about it in terms of the crisis that it involves, but of the tiny things and the tiny elements that appear in our life every day. So really, this is not so much about what it is or why it's happening, but how to speak about it and how to think about it. And I want to tell you a little bit about 3 stories, or try to give you some elements that would help us to try to negotiate our relationship with this issue and this topic. So, what is now? Where are we now? What does involve being a citizen on the world in November of 2017 in a capital in the south of Europe? I don't think it will be a surprise to anybody to understand that our sense of the now is pretty much conditioned by a series of kind of interlocking crises that enter in and out of focus, and that influence most things that appear in the headlines, that influence most of the decisions on a political and economic level that affects our lives in different ways. And our capacity to understand this sense of the now and to negotiate it and to move around it is pretty much conditioned by our sense of agency. What can we do about it? By our sense of how are we conditioned or limited by the things that this specific crisis is producing, and how can we, have a sense of responsibility or a sense of belonging to these different crises. So if you think about the resolution, kind of you zoom in and out to everything that affects your life, these things happen on all kinds of scales. So now can be 1 month, a sense of collapse in the principles of how do we negotiate the identities, collective identities, and the artifact of the nation state, an artifact that is becoming more and more problematic as years go by. And so now can be the urgency of understanding everything that is affecting us in a moment in which our sense of the normal collapses, and we definitely exist in a place and in a time where things are definitely not normal. Or now can be what happens on the scale of the year, in turning moments, in points of transformation, in shifts that radically transform the norms of what we can expect from the future. I don't think I'm saying anything new to you, saying like 2016 and 2017 have been incredibly convulsive years. The Brexit referendum in the UK creates a rift in the center of the common project of the European Union and opens one huge space of uncertainty towards the future. The nightmare that involves the breaking up of politics so that emerging phenomena appear and condition what can we think about politics, how can politics affect us in different way, still condition very much our sense of the future, so that our future is a victim of the very short of the last month, is a victim of the crisis of the not so short but still short term, the year. But we are still living in the aftermath, in the expansion wave of different explosions, and all these explosions are interlocked in one way or another. So you could say that in a way now is also, of course, the last 10 years under the shadow of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, that basically broke all kind of trust in the foundations of our economic model, and open up a space or an opportunity for rethinking most of the systems that affect us in the world, from, again, the nation state to economic growth, to growth as a tool for well-being, to equality, and how inequality becomes a big reef in the center of most contemporary societies. And now it's also the geopolitical crisis of the last 15 years that create an unstable order in the world. And all these things are there, almost have concentric circles in which we exist, in which we inhabit. And for most of the time, everything that happens in one way or another on a daily basis seems to be interlocked within the expansion wave of this crisis, whether you have someone which is out of job, or there is a terrorist attack that could personally affect you, or you have an absolute uncertainty about how the rest of your life is going to be in this city, in this continent, or in this hemisphere. But now is actually other kind of transformations that are much more difficult to define and much more difficult to focus, because our senses don't operate on that resolution, because our units of time and perception, our small units that we've been given of 80 years, don't necessarily operate or don't work that well to perceive them. So for some people, actually, our life will also be conditioned by other expansive waves that can go back as far away as 12,000 years, when agriculture on a bigger scale produced the first serious capacity of intervention of men in the shaping of landscape and in natural systems. Now it's also determined by the scale of the last 150 years, when industrialization started creating this huge process that meant starting to burn fossil fuels and put the emissions of these fossil fuels in the atmosphere. So we started first remodeling the surface of Earth with agriculture, now changing the chemical composition of the air that we breathe, and creating also the connection, or kind of the link between development, growth, and progress, which sort of has defined every parameter of our modern civilization, which was based basically on this fact that we could take something from the ground, turn it into work, into productive force, and put what we didn't need it up there in the atmosphere. And it worked for a little while. When we started doing this, there was 1 million of us. When we started doing this, there was 1,000 millions of us. And then things started getting really crazy. To a certain extent, the most precise definition, or the scientifically most accurate definition of when did now started, when was actually starting point of now, funnily enough, you wouldn't probably imagine it, has a very specific date. It was 5:29 in the morning on July 16, 1945, and this happened. Whoop. This is the detonation of Trinity, the first atomic test that radically altered man's relationship with the planet and with the geological record. From this moment on, there was no doubt, if you are extraterrestrial civilization and a few millions from now arrive here in the planet and want to find the definite proof that there was a civilization in this planet, there would be like an alteration in the geological record that would definitely, for once and for all, clear the idea that there was a moment, there was a point when something happened, and some people who were one of the species of the planet took over the shape, the form, and the feature of the planet in a very radical way. So the detonation of Trinity, the first test of the atomic bomb, in a way settles or closes the discussion of this. When did the most recent geological age of the Earth started? This is the classic representation of the ages of the Earth, going back to approximately 3 billion years. And the last tiny section, the one that you see here in the back, this tiny section, is where the whole of the history of man happened, in the Holocene. And at some point, in some moment, we start wondering, is this going to go on forever? Are we still there? Is that the age in which we are still living? The detonation of Trinity kind of creates a geological marker that defines in a very precise and clear way that is not exactly the case anymore, and that we have a strong positive arguments to think that there is a new barrier or a border in the history of the ages of the planet, and that marker, that line splitting that from the next, is us. These guys are some of the people with the most fascinating work in the world. These are the members of the Anthropocene working group. These are geologists from all over the world who were given the task a few years ago of trying to find definitive proof or parameters that can be accepted by the scientific community that we can test the hypothesis formulated in around 2000 that the planet Earth is not living in the Holocene anymore, the Holocene being the 12,000 years in which the whole history of mankind took place, but that we have entered a new geological age. And this new geological age is called the and the defining factor of the Anthropocene is that the main force of transformation affecting natural systems today in the world, capable of shaping and remodeling them, is the activity of man. If the detonation of Trinity happens in 1945, by the end of the Second World War, our capacity to exploit natural systems, increasing developments in telecommunications, in information processing, and also in the shaping of the global markets, allowing for international trade, starts a period that some people have called the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration basically is a series of indicators that you can see in many phenomena that you look at in the world. You see all this exponential rise. So this exponential rise are all starting from 1950. This line that you see in every point is 1950. And you can look at things like urban population, paper consumption, McDonald's restaurants, ocean ecosystems, international tourism, many indicators that basically sort of point at the fact that the path of development of humankind around the 50s reach a specific tipping point, and that tipping point transformed the behavior of many of the indicators which we use to measure growth and our impact in the ecosystems. This is basically the most clear sign, or actually the driver of a process by which at some specific point in time, a point in which probably your parents were born, but very likely your grandparents were still not born. Your grandparents were born, but your parents didn't. So 2 generations away, something changed in the shape of the impact of man on the planet and the size of humankind as a species and the way it impacted with the planet. So the boom of consumer society after the Second World War, the huge boom in life expectancy, development in emerging countries basically justifies or produces a world which in 1950 had 2,500 million people, 2.5 billion people, and that today, in these 50 years, has 7.5 billion people. Basically, mankind today is 3 times bigger than at the start of the Great Acceleration. One of the science of that the Anthropocene Working Group has determined to show another shape or another marker in the geological record that will allow future civilizations to understand that something happened around this age will be the presence all over the planet in huge numbers of domestic chicken bones. Because the domestic chicken is the most extended bird on the planet. It is the main source, or one of the main sources of protein for millions and millions of people in the world. And also, interestingly, in a way, it's a bird that was made by humans, because it's the result of heavy intervention through breeding in different chicken species until producing the perfect chicken for feeding. So you can imagine yourself being anthropologists from the future, or being geologists from the future, going down in the geological record, and then at some point starting finding the chicken bones, and finding the chicken bones all over the planet at any point. The 60 billion domestic chickens that are slaughtered each year are a human creation that has only existed for these 5 decades. In a way, they are a native species of a new Earth, you know, of a new planet, a planet that is definitely a different planet to the one that our grandparents lived on just 2 generations ago. So in a way, we can say that the Anthropocene planet is a different planet to planet Earth. And like in Planet of the Apes, the famous science fiction film, we got into a spaceship, went out in space, crashed into a strange planet, and we ended up actually discovering that strange planet in which we crashed is the same planet in which we live. But it's not the same planet in which we live, because we have changed the chemical composition of the oceans, we have changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere, we have moved millions and millions of tons every year of sediment, reshaping the shape of mountains, changing the profile of coast. In a way, we are living now in the planet we made, a planet that will be 9,000 million people in 2050, in the next stage. So, what does it mean living in now? Some people are actually a bit skeptical about the same notion of the Anthropocene. The notion of the Anthropocene saying that, yeah, the planet crashed with a meteorite, but we were the meteorite, you know. That there is a new global phenomenon reshaping realities of the planet, and that's us, that's men. Some people are a bit critical of that thesis because they say that it's actually not everybody. It's actually not everybody on the same proportion, and it's actually not everybody with the same force. So when we say that Anthropocene is the geological age created by the impact of human on the planet, another formulation would be, it's actually the geological age created by the impact of capital, of one specific mode of economic exploitation, driven by specific countries, benefiting very specific layers of society. That's why other authors like Donna Haraway have preferred the concept of a capitalocene, you know. And in the notion of the capitalocene, for instance, there are ideas like maybe it was not the engine, the steam engine, the driver of the Industrial Revolution, what marked the tipping point, but it was actually international trade and international trade from the Renaissance on, which created a specific model of economic development, capitalism, which took natural resources as if they were infinite, exploited them, and threw the externalities away, what they didn't need, without thinking that would have any impact. In a way, we know that the use of natural resources, that path of using natural resources was a borrowing. It's as if we borrowed progress from the bank, and now we're going to have to start paying back. But in any case, whether it's men or it's capital, whether it's the anthropos or the capitalocene, this is where we are. And this is the ugly part of the talk. This is we all know this, but maybe we don't think about this enough and we don't say it in public. So let's do it. This is the Manualo Observatory in Hawaii. I love to find these images and these places because some of the key facts of today are actually coming from places or tied to places. So this is an observatory in Hawaii that has been monitoring for the longest time since the early 20th century the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is where we measure what is the proportion of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. When at the start of the Industrial Revolution, when we started putting CO2 by burning coal in the atmosphere, it was 280 parts per million. May 9, 2013, so that's a little more than 4 years ago, we crossed the threshold of 400 parts per million. In principle, it wouldn't be wise to go through 350, but we crossed that line long ago. So 400 parts per million is a very symbolic line to cross. Last year it was 403, so we are still doing well there. Just to understand what I'm saying, what I mean that we're living in a different planet, the last time that the atmosphere of the planet was at 400 parts of CO2 per million was 4 million years ago, when men didn't exist. So we are actually living with a new atmosphere in a very direct way. This is the graph of evolution of global temperature change between the mid-19th century at the start of the Industrial Revolution and today. We know, or you probably know, that temperature is rising. We all know that temperature is rising. Maybe we don't know to the extent to which it's rising. The 3 hottest years ever recorded were last year, 2 years ago, and 3 years ago. 16 out of the 17 hottest years recorded have been in the 21st century. So basically, when we cross the threshold of the 21st century, we definitely enter in a different relationship with climate. Here you are seeing the average means year by year. We're getting close to the line of 1.5 average rise in temperatures, and the other is the line in 2. We'll talk about those numbers, 1.5 and 2, a little bit later. In the winter of 2017, so this last winter, the combined surface of ice, the amount of ice we had in the North Pole and the South Pole, was the lowest observed since we have measurements, which is 4 decades ago. So we don't know everything about the behavior of ice on time, but we know that this winter we had less combined ice between the North and the South Pole than at any point in the last 40 years. In the summers, the ice in the Arctic, which is under a heavier impact than the Antarctic. The Antarctic, it's actually really wild because we are not completely sure about what is going on there, but I'll tell you about that later if you're interested. But the ice in the Arctic today is covering a little bit under half of what it covered at the beginning of the 70s, so 35 years ago. And as we all know, the problem with all this ice melting, Archimedes' principle, is that all that melting water has to go somewhere. If we have more water, the water is going to occupy more space. And not only that, when water gets hotter, it expands, so it uses a lot more of space. So all the ice that is melting is going to end up basically on the sea, and then by melting, it will rise the level of the sea. Every year, we know that sea level is rising around 4 millimeters. We know that it will keep on rising for many, many years. There is no way that we can stop sea level rise on a short scale. We know that in specific cities, in specific areas where sea level or the city built level of the sea is relatively small, the rise of the probability of rise of flooding will increase. For instance, in cities like San Francisco or Mumbai, 5 to 10 centimeters in the next 15 years. So when you are going out there, and here in Barcelona, for instance, you can go and look at the sea, understand that the sea is coming, and that our relationship with the sea is going to change year after year as we renegotiate this direct reality. Last year, Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which is the biggest living organism in the planet. It's the largest living structure. Suffered the worst loss of coral ever recorded, with more than 95% of the reef suffering bleaching. Bleaching is what happens here in the center of the image when the coral gets white, which is the first sign of serious damage. Bleaching was detected in more than 95% of the length of the Great Coral Barrier, extending for 700 kilometers. 67 of the corals disappear in just 9 months. The largest living being in the planet is dying. And we can actually not discuss it every day, and we can actually try in a way not to put it very much in the center of our concerns, but it's likely that this, in a way, requires for awareness, meditation, and kind of a recognition of what is the state of the world in 2017. In 2017, the average temperature of the planet at this point is 1 degree Celsius above the level at the start of the Industrial Revolution. If we took all the CO2 emissions that we're producing today and did nothing, and we kept on releasing it like that, we basically know that they would rise by the end of the century, by 2100, 3.7 to 4.8 Celsius degrees. Remember that we're already living 1 degree over the levels of 1850. There are voices that says that normal living conditions under a 4-degree temperature rise in medium are probably not easy or not likely. There is no many chances of thinking that a +4 degree world would look mostly similar, or where parameters for life conditions every day would be mostly similar to parameters of life today. In the words of the World Bank, there are no certainty that adaptation to a 4+ degrees world is actually possible. The irony in terms of the situation in which we find ourselves today, or like the clash between the economic models of the world that we've been building and how they crash with the realities of the planet, is that if you took all the coal, all the oil, and all natural gas reserves underground that are identified, discovered, if we try to map all of the fossil resources that we have in the world and burn them, and put all those 2 emissions in the atmosphere, we know that we will be rising temperatures enough to melt all the ice in Antarctica and rise the sea level by more than 45 meters. 45 meters is like more than half of Barcelona, something like that. Don't worry, because we are not doing it, and we are not going to do it. I don't know that we are safe. I don't know that we are finding a path away, but we are not going to burn all of that coal, natural gas, and oil unless Trump and Putin really work very hard for it. They're trying to, but I'm optimistic that actually it's a little bit better. There was a moment where we had to have this conversation, and the moment in which all the nations of the world decided that this was a conversation that needed to be had and that needed to start being modeled was, as probably many of you know, but I want to highlight the main acts. In December 2015, at the conference of the Paris 21, the 21st climate conference that joined all countries of the world in Paris in December, so that's almost 2 years ago. And the decision had to be taken at some point that what was the biggest source of wealth in the history of mankind, the biggest source of economic growth, what had turned this planet of 1,000 million people in the year 1850 to a planet of 7,500 million people in the year 2017, what was very much the inventor, the factor that invented the modern world, had to be given away forever. And this is basically what was agreed on Paris in December 15. So what was basically signed in Paris? What was the thing that, in theory, all countries in the world committed to? And I will speak this all countries in the world. The Paris Agreement was ratified by 195 countries in the world, which were all countries in the world except for Syria and Nicaragua. Nicaragua didn't sign it because they thought they was not ambitious enough. Syria didn't sign it because they were in the middle of a terrible civil war. Now today, 2 years after that, Syria has just ratified it, Nicaragua has just ratified it. So at this point, today, all the countries in the world are in the Paris Agreement. Now, some of you will say, yeah, but the US is going to leave it. Well, the situation there is that Trump has said that they have the intention of leaving the Paris Agreement, but that is a long process that takes for 3 years. The act has still not been properly ratified, so there is no actual paper saying now that the process for the US to abandon the Paris Agreement has already started and is irrevocable. And the absolute incredible irony is that if this process takes place, the US will not be able to leave the Paris Agreement until, and this is an incredible coincidence, but it's total coincidence, the day after the next American elections. So it could perfectly be the case that Trump would do all of this, and then on the electoral night, the new president would say, we're stopping it, we're staying in the Paris Agreement. So it's going to be a thrilling years to know if the biggest economic power in the world and the second biggest polluter in the world is going to stay or is not going to stay in the Paris Agreement. So what does the Paris Agreement say, for instance, for all of us who are here in this room and are citizens of Barcelona? All countries in the world have to commit to a reduction in their CO2 emissions that will put them and that will give them one specific midterm goal. So in the case of the European Union, this means that in 2030 we would be having to release 40% less of CO2 in the atmosphere that we would be releasing in 1990. So the goal for the European Union is 40% less of CO2 emissions than we were doing in 1990. Other countries like China, for instance, who have set their own targets, won't stop reducing the number of emissions until 2030, although they are doing incredibly well. And at this point, actually, it could be the case that they are reducing them way, way faster. Basically, the way that the Paris Agreement works, I know this is the boring part, but it's very important for everybody to understand this and know this, is that it was signed in 2015, then all countries have to ratify it. Almost 2/3 of the countries have already ratified it. It will enter in effect in 2020, and then every 5 years, countries have to declare how much progress have they made, and then they have to declare if they are sticking to those commitments of reduction or they are changing those commitments of reductions. But the really big deadline, like the real red line in a way of the Paris Agreement, is in the second part of the 21st century, because the goal of the Paris Agreement is that at some point to specify in the second part of the 21st century, between 2050 and 2100, CO2 emissions to the atmosphere are zero, so that all the remaining oil in the world, all the remaining gas in the world, or the remaining coal in the world will have to stay under the ground forever. Here's the bad news. We can probably do that because actually progress in renewables is being very, very fast, but that only takes us halfway there. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to ensure that global temperatures don't rise more than 2 Celsius degrees in the next 50 years, in the next 83 years, so that the citizens of the world in 2100 will live in a world, in the worst case scenario, 2 degrees hotter than the ones in which we were living in 1850. Ideally, 1.5 degrees. What the Paris Agreement says is that we're aiming for 2 degrees, but if we can reach 1.5 degrees, much better. People is not very optimistic because today, in 2017, we are at 1 degree. So we have basically 1 degree more left, or half of it. But then, as I was saying, the bad news is that if we do that, if we reduce all CO2 emissions, we are still only halfway there. We're actually still looking at least 3.6 temperature rise. So how are we going to be able to do the other half? We have to invent a way by which we compensate the other half of reduction in emissions, or in temperature rise, that stopping CO2 emissions forever won't give us. So we have to learn to develop ways of taking that CO2 out of the atmosphere. There are only 2 ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. One is reforestation, by planting more and more trees, so these trees capture CO2 and they release oxygen. And the other is by experimental technologies that can actually extract the CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is probably the gold rush of the next 50 years. Unfortunately, we are still not very good at it. We still don't know that much about how do we take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So, There are a few scenarios. One is that we managed to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. There is another one, which is we don't. So I will start with what happens if we don't reach it. So the projection of the UN FCCC is that we are looking at a temperature rise 3.6 to 4.8 average in the rise of global temperatures. And this basically guarantees a series of statistical probabilities that extreme weather events will rise. So when we are talking about extreme weather events, we are talking about drought, we are talking about hurricanes, we're talking about obviously floodings, and these will undoubtedly have economic impacts and will have social impacts. Things like, for instance, global food production will definitely be impacted by a world with more extreme weather events. This will also create hard conditions of living in many places that will kick in, as it's already happening in different ways, migrations. So we know that a world of 3.6 to 4.8 degrees is a world with huge migrations. And of course, sea level rise would completely change the shape and the ways in which the recognizable profiles of the world take place. So again, these numbers are always under permanent revision. It's hard to try to predict something that is an incredibly complex system of which we don't know that much about. But in a scenario of 3.6 to 4.8 temperature levels rise, we're looking at 1.8 to 3 meters of sea level rise in 80 years by 2100. All predictions stop at 2100. That's as far as we want to go. So what does this imply? What this implies, and this is actually what I wanted to talk about for the rest of the talk, is that either if we manage to commit to the Paris Agreement or if we don't, if we manage to stop those worst scenarios or we end up in the worst scenarios, there is no actual chance that life in the second part of the 21st century, that life in that period between 2050 and 2100 looks basically as it does today. Many systems of the world, many ways in which we do things will have to change because there is just no there is no way to preserve them operating with the same kind of energy usage, with the same kind of ecological footprint in one way or another. And in the words of Mackenzie's work, which is a contemporary philosopher who's one of the main people working in thinking a philosophy of the Anthropocene, the clear implication of this is that this civilization is already over and everybody knows it. What does this mean? This means that basically the parameters under which we have understood modern civilization, which are not at all, it starts, as I said, mid-19th century, are not possible to be prolonged in the future, you know? And this is not a tragedy. I have like a lot of problems explain that this is not a tragedy. Every civilization is built on top of the previous one. All parameters of reality of what we consider the normal, the aspects of everyday living are just the set of values that we have inherited by every process of conquest and colonization from one civilization by another. And we are right now at the tipping point and the moment in which we have to start thinking about building and started building this new civilization. Because there is, as I said, this is the main point that I have to make today, there is no actual possibility that we can maintain the parameters of normal life, either if we meet the Paris Agreement, because we will need radical transformations to meet it, or if we don't, because living conditions will change radically in the world that surrounds us. This is Donald Trump surrounded by workers from the coal, mining and coal industry. Obviously, it's not going to be easy, and there's not going to be an easy way to push back the main elements and the main pillars of the old civilization, and especially of those who are still trying to, look how many men, look how white they are all. All our men are white, and they don't have that much hair. That's kind of like the main sign and indicator of the past. So, in a way, for some people, Trump, Putin are kind of the markers that the party is finishing, that the last boom to make a lot of money and make it quick on the fossil fuel industry is now, that there is no chance or no possibility that some of the most powerful people in the world will be able to become more rich or as rich as they have become in the past, exploiting the main source of wealth in the world. And obviously there's going to be a lot of resistance, and there is a lot of resistance. But that resistance doesn't change the essential or the fundamental, which is that there is no possible way, there is no possibility of prolonging the parameters of a model of society that was built on top of the fossil fuels industry. Now, when we think about the future, and when we think about future civilizations, it seems that we can only oscillate between two images. When we think about how can that world of 2100 look like, it seems that we can only think in terms of sustainable utopia. And I'm going to say that architects are some of the people most to blame for this, this not very sophisticated notion of a sustainable garden city where bicycles and high density will solve most of the problems created by the energy model. And there is nothing bad here, I think. It's just not a very radical exercise of the imagination. But actually, for most people, the future always looks like this, It's like the apocalyptic vision in which we are stuck, and that basically imagines the future as an ongoing fight for every resource, for the last resource until the very last moment, like this kind of war that happens at the end of a civilization where people are on their own and there is no structure, shape of society as we try to preserve the crumbles of the decaying model. The only thing that is clear is that any post-Paris future, that any future thinking about the world after the Paris Agreement is going to be ideological. Every future is full of ideology. Every future is political. And we are going to need a lot of more experimentation of thinking how this society is going to work or what could be its parameters. Because actually, there are many different ideologies at work here. There are many different political proposals being thrown on the table, and all of them have qualities, I think, and all of them have problems. So, for instance, we can think in terms of degrowth. We can think that the society of the 21st century, or the 22nd century, actually, the society after 2100, will, in a way, look way more like the society before the industrial boom, and that we can all go back to the countryside and reduce our footprint and go back to cheese, and in a way re-engage with a more harmonic relationship with nature that we completely romanticize by thinking about how life was before the industrial age. The problem is that this model doesn't scale. We don't know how to do this for 7,500 million people and feed them 3 times a day. So we're going to need something a bit more radical. Then there is the ideology, which we can see in many environments today, which basically thinks that we can mostly preserve the parameters of the capitalist model. We just only need to solve the technical problem. And it thinks that climate change is mostly a technical problem. And the center of this ideology is basically taking renewable energies and taking fossil fuels and replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, and you don't need to change a lot of that, and we are mostly fine. Here's the bad news: we are not fine. The numbers don't add up. We will not solve this problem simply by replacing fossil fuels with renewable energies. So probably the problem is not replacing your gas car by a Tesla. The problem is, are we gonna ever be able to invest the number of tons and energy usage that a car produces in one single individual and replace it every 5 to 7 years? Probably the answer is no. So we're gonna probably have to be way more radical in rethinking the main parameters of how society organizes. Then the most radical of them all, the acceleration, is kind of propose or suggest in a way that even though we created this problem by radical intervention in the systems of nature, what we need is not less radical intervention in the systems of nature, but more of it. So, for instance, the only problem the problem that we really need to solve is how do we learn to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere? How do we block the rays of sun in the atmosphere so we get less radiation from the sun inside? How can we reduce the acidity of the oceans, for instance, by dropping huge amounts of iron that we know to have an effect? And so that's basically almost kind of like a matrix model where we keep on tweaking natural systems so as we go on adapting with it. Some people think that a certain level of intervention, this is what is called geoengineering, the notion that we can engineer the natural systems way more radical. So some people think that a certain level of geoengineering will be necessary. But the reality is that geoengineering, it's very difficult to see as a solution when there is no trial that we can make on a small sample of a planet, and then if it works, try it at a huge scale on the whole planet. The problem is that the systems of the Earth are closed. The Earth is a closed loop. And when you make a test in the atmosphere, you cannot do it just in this section of the atmosphere. You are doing all over the atmosphere. So to give you an example, this is another really scary example of some of the most radical scenarios. One of the most well-known solutions to temperature rise, one of the proposals coming from the geoengineering community is spreading aerosols on the clouds that will block radiations because some of the light will bounce back. So we will be able to reduce the impact of sun on the temperature rise in the planet by blocking it with spreading these aerosols in the atmosphere. The problem is that we know that if we start doing it, then we have to keep on doing it forever, because the moment that we stop doing it, everything that we prevented from happening will kick in and happen all at once. And there are even some theories that when we start radical application of aerosols to block the rays of the sun, we could actually end up in a scenario where we don't have blue skies anywhere ever again. So there's your matrix scenario for you of a world in which we literally change the sky forever. And then there are other, of course, accelerationist scenarios, which are the ones who are the most escapist ones, suggesting that we should start escaping the planet and thinking about Mars, which is a bit of a problem as a solution because we still don't know how to keep one single person alive on Mars. So it's going to take some work. The ecologists saying there is no planet B is still true. Maybe one day Mars will be planet B, but as of today, that is definitely not an option. And some theories, which are less known but are actually very interesting, talk about mutualism. The idea of mutualism is that we can actually forge a new pact with nature, so that our relationship with nature is not defined by exploitation, by taking the resources, living and non-living resources of the earth and using them, but by collaboration. Against the idea that Darwin introduced very much in our collective psyche, that most relations in nature are exploitative, of life forms exploiting other life forms, the big fish eating the small fish. Biologists like Lynn Margulis introduced the idea that actually most relationships in nature are symbiotic, are relationships of collaboration. Two organisms engage in a process by which both of them are mutually benefited. So would it be a process or a model for humankind to establish radical symbiotic relationships with the rest of life forms in the planet, so that for us to ensure that they are well maintained, we are ensuring that we are well maintained, that their health depends on us and our health depends on them. And to me, this is actually the most radical vision of all, and it will take a lot of work and it will take a lot of imagination. So, a few key points to think about how to live after the end of the world and where we are right now. And this is the last things that I wanted to tell you about, so that you can end up actually in a way going to the exhibition and being able to see how these things translate in real time. I think that the space in which we are right now in society is basically defined by trauma. When we choose to speak about climate change or not to speak about climate change, we are basically existing in one specific mental condition. And the comparison that I like to make is that we are like the patient who has gone to the doctor and he has entered into the doctor's office, and then the doctor gives them a very bad piece of news. And then when you receive this bad news, you know that things are never going to be the same. but you still feel the same. You don't feel different as you felt 1 minute before being told that there was something very bad going on. So on a mental level, you know it is bad, but at the same time on an emotional level, you're still trying to negotiate this kind of dissociation, of feeling in two ways, in two forms at the same time. This is basically one of the conditions of trauma, is denial, is uncomprehension, and this is where we are basically stuck in a society. So after trauma, I think, comes empathy, comes concern for each other, trying to communicate how you're feeling and letting people understand that you're there for them, that they can be there for you, and try to negotiate together the position of the trauma. I think, and I might be wrong, I'll be proven right or wrong, that we are in the years where we are starting to get out of the first trauma shock and starting to cope with reality, and then sliding slowly towards empathy. So we'll have to see how do we negotiate this transition between trauma and empathy. One of the, to me, key notions or key concepts to live in the world after the end of the world, in this new civilization that we have started, which is not about, by the way, solving climate change. It's about coping with it. It's about living with it. It is about, as Donna Haraway says, staying with the trouble, because we're going to stay with the trouble. Climate change is going to be the defining conditions of our lives, of the life of everybody in this room, for the rest of our lives, for as long as it goes on. One of the things that we need to understand is that what has taken us here is thinking that the necessities of the human species are way more important than the necessities of any other species. And understanding also that the necessities of the humans of now are more important than the necessities of the humans and the non-humans of tomorrow. So there is no way out of this crisis that doesn't involve a deep, almost philosophical transformation, where we seriously really understand that the men and women of 2017 don't have more rights than the men and women of 2100, and the jellyfish, the coral reef, the tuna of 2017 and 2100. And this is going to take a really radical social transformation, but there's actually no way around it. One of the huge problems that we have is that we're trying to solve a problem with tools that are completely inefficient. Like the tools that we have to sort out this problem are totally broken. It's almost like a bit pathetic trying to solve a problem of this scale with the tools that we have. Of course, the main tools that we have is politics. But politics has created like this short-term set of incentives in which we have to operate, which means that the most important thing in the world is what people who vote want, and what people who vote will want for them to vote you in 4 years' time again. Now, here is the paradox. It actually would be kind of like a bit broken to have to take decisions that only create incentives to be solved in 4 years' time. But you know what? The way the world is being, there is less and less chance that is in 4 years' time. In the UK, it's been 1.5 years. Here, we're going for our 4th election in 7 years. So actually, the time scale is getting smaller and smaller. So the set of incentives is actually more and more non-functional, because basically we're in the situation where politicians will have to explain to us, we have to take rough decisions, and these decisions are going to be worse for you in the short term, but they are necessary so that we will be able to solve a problem that will be very, very, very prejudicial for people in the long term. And now please vote me again in 4 years. That's like a really complex equilibrium to sort out. So in a way, I think that we kind of need a deep time of politics. The time that, like this notion of deep time is how we measure distance, for instance, in a space, where things are measured in the distance that light takes to travel for 1 year. We are right now, in 2017, trying to solve a political problem of 2100. So we're trying to do a politics of 83 years from now. And it's going to be very hard to try to negotiate how we do it. We haven't actually... I didn't want to talk about the projects and the context of the exhibition in this talk. That's why I still haven't done it so far. So I have given you 0 spoilers, which for me was important. But I have to make an exception for this. One of the projects in the exhibition is setting up a Ministry of the Future that would be part of every government, we wanted to find different people that would take the position of Ministry of the Future. And the Ministry of the Future would be a position that would exist in every government where that minister would not be representing the interests of the voters of today, of the people who voted for the government, but would be representing the interests of the people who cannot vote because they still haven't been born, or they still have not have an age to vote, or of the people who cannot vote because they are not people. So the Minister of the Future would have a constituency made up of the people of tomorrow and the non-people of today and tomorrow. And we have chosen Timothy Morton, a philosopher of the Anthropocene, one of the most vocal people in philosophy, producing a new philosophical model for the Anthropocene to occupy the position of Minister of the Future for the first term. And then there is something incredibly important, very, very important, and I think we have to be very aware of this. We're trying to solve a problem for hypothetical people or what we think are hypothetical people. We have to accept something that no politician will tell us because it's a really, really bad political selling point, which is we cannot go on living the way we do, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of people who still haven't been born. And then it's very hard to take decisions for the benefit of people who don't exist. But actually that's not even true, because the people who are being born today, the people who were born today, will be 83 years old in 2100. Probably none of us will see that world of the second half of the 21st century where we have to discover if this problem that we have to solve can be solved or not, but they will. There is a certain asymmetry if you have sons today, or if you have nieces that are, I don't know, 4 years, that there is like an incredibly unfair situation where everything that we don't do will be something that they will have to do on their own, or that we will be doing to them. So it's actually quite amazing. I don't have kids, but I always make this mental exercise that if you ask any parent if they would do anything for their children, all of them say, of course I would do anything for my children. But if that anything is stop driving, stop eating meat 5 times a week, not flying, reducing your carbon footprint, somehow that suddenly seems harder. And the realities of the framework defined by the Paris Agreement is that these are not hypothetical risks. These are absolutely real risks. This is more dangerous than being hit by a car on the street. So right now, we exist basically in this paradigm or in this parameter. Either we forge a pact between generations, if we do things for the benefit of the generations that will come after us, or we are waging a war between generations. We are at war with those people who are 2, 3, 4 years old today. And this actually implies a very radical psychological transformation. It's been very hard to be at war with people who are 3 years old. This is James Hansen. This is an important picture. James Hansen is a scientist working at NASA, and in 1988, it will be 40 years next year, he was the first person to in front of a political body in the American Congress, go on in public and say, there is something wrong with the weather. We are doing something and this is going to have impacts. James Hansen, in his first declaration in 1988, in a way identified and gave shape to the notion that there is something as global warming. We are causing it by an economic model. It's going to have catastrophic effects. We have to change direction and develop another relationship to energy and another form of growth that is not based on this. Hansen is really a myth and a very inspiring figure in climate science. This is James Hansen in 2011 being arrested in a protest. Hansen retired in 2008 to commit completely to activism. So he went from being one of the most important climate scientists in the world to be one of the most well-known climate activists in the world. And Hansen is one of the most open voices saying that we have to, in a very direct and forced way, understand that this relationship that we are actually establishing with those generations of the future is real, is practical. So we have to understand how do we negotiate with people who are 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old. So last year he joined this group called Our Children's Trust, and he started a lawsuit against the American government. It's like the first proper lawsuit when they are asking for damages and responsibility to those in charge of the economic model of the world, because we, or they, as children, are going to be being given a completely unfair set of living conditions by the people who are taking the decisions that sustain our economic model. And this is actually the paradigm that we are in right now. And this is what we're trying to, in a way, explore in this exhibition. The opening of the exhibition, it's a story by one of the most well-known science fiction writers in the world, Kim Stanley Robinson. Kim Stanley Robinson in 1990 wrote a book called Red Mars, about the conquest of Mars, in which we was, in a way, saying that any hypothetical conquest of Mars and a process of transforming Mars into a new Earth will be an opportunity to start a new society. And that new society would have to exist under the social, economic parameters of the old one. So any new planet is an opportunity for a new society. He has written a prologue for this exhibition, and this tiny fragment that I'm going to play is a trailer for the show that actually gives you a bit of a clue about what is the starting point, or where are we going.
Every moment is strange. You feel this when you look around. Now it's stranger than ever. We fly forward at an accelerating rate. History is speeding up. Both catastrophe and utopia are possible from this moment, while the zone between them gets less and less likely. A stark choice, and we're choosing it now by everything we do and don't do. We are the primitives of an unknown civilization.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, José Luis. So now is the moment of the questions from the public.
I'm so sorry if this was a bit pessimistic. I am not a pessimist at all, I can tell you.
So let's challenge him. Let's see if he's not a pessimist.
Hello, Luis.
Yeah.
Number one, thank you for coming. Thank you for giving us this amazing lecture.
Yeah.
Once again, you really made us think. It's a challenge for me to ask you questions in general, because you were my tutor last year, and I don't know, I think I was a little bit surprised in general by the presentation, because I got to know you as a deep thinker of the digital age in general. That's how we introduced each other. And I was wondering, I'm a bit baffled, where in your research, this story of everything, do you take into consideration the acceleration of the information technologies? And I don't want to make any assumptions for the future, but it seems that if we're going to actually make stories about the future, or make assumptions or scenarios about the future, which is something that here we do quite a lot, we would be remiss not to include a possible acceleration of something that has not moved for the past 12,000 years, and that is the human software, human bandwidth, the way we think, the way we process things. And we are on the cusp that something like this might actually occur. What are your thoughts on this?
So there is this aspiration that is actually not new, it's kind of old, that information and digital communications will actually allow us to develop kind of a global conscience that in a way will make us change our relationship with the planet, so that in a way somehow transmission of information and the whole idea of the global mind in a way is connected with this. And the really incredible thing, Alex, is that this is not a story of the 90s or the 80s. This is a story from the 60s, you know? In a way, it's similar in digital culture to have this aspiration. The problem is that it doesn't add up. That is not the actual reality of how we are actually transforming or seeing the transformation of a culture through technology in another kind of relationship with the planet. So, for an example, you could say that without digital technology and without information networks, you wouldn't have the global supply chain. You wouldn't be able to put one fashion design that is designed at the Mango design facilities, which are 30 kilometers from here, sent to Bangladesh, get it actually designed, and then ship back from Shenzhen back to Europe and make all of this. So design from a fashion designer takes 3 weeks to go from one design desk to the stores of hundreds of stores all over the world in 3 weeks. And this jump obviously has huge environmental repercussions. So when we look about our stories of how we tell ourselves that information was going to allow us to have a less forceful impact on the planet, we see that this doesn't really add up in many cases. Or for instance, when we see there is this huge boom of enthusiasm by crypto coin technologies like Bitcoin and technologies like the blockchain, and it's amazing to see that we have developed a system that is on purpose inefficient in terms of energy usage, because it actually, in a way, made that resource computation more valuable, which translated into money. There is, and I think, I'm sorry to be pessimistic about that, no possibility, mediated by information technology or not, to change our relationship with the basic material realities of the planet. That doesn't happen also at the cultural and political level. It's not just... climate change is not going to be invented out of a garage in Silicon Valley, which is actually kind of amazing. That there was almost this aspiration that technological innovation will be enough on its own always to change everything. And it would be brilliant if it was, but this is actually a way more complex world, you know? So that is actually not going to solve the problem that maybe the fast fashion paradigm by which we are asked to buy new clothes that are only getting cheaper and cheaper all the time, you know, is not a sustainable paradigm. Or it will be nice when we have synthetic meat, so we don't have to eat actual meat, but the first change is that we cannot actually eat meat 5 times a week. And you know why we know that? Because no one has ever done it before in the history of mankind, ever. So it's both tempting and it's necessary to operate in that axis, but we are deluding ourselves if we think that that is going to sort out the problem on its own.
What makes you so certain?
Because we haven't had one single sign in the last 50 years that is happening. I'll give you an amazing piece of information. This one is one of the ones that are more scary. 63% of CO2 emissions, 63% have been released in the last 25 years. There's been not one single generation that has had more responsibility for the transformation of the chemical composition of the atmosphere than the one that existed in the paradigm under neoliberalism since 1990 today. Now, can there be like one single technological breakthrough that suddenly out of nowhere solves this problem? Maybe, I will give it the credit, but the thing is that if we know that in the age of the boom of information technology, not only we didn't solve the problem, but we made it much, much worse, why should we expect that on its own that is going to solve it?
You mentioned that renewable energy was not enough, and then you went on to other interesting things quite fast. Can you dive a little bit deeper on that?
Sorry, I couldn't
So you mentioned that renewable energy,
yeah.
changing to that would not be enough.
Yeah.
Can you go a little bit further into that?
Yeah, I mean, basically if you take every energy form of energy usage in the world and you replace it by renewable, you are reducing the impact of CO2 emissions in many, many levels, but you are not changing, for instance, deforestation, which is a huge problem contribution to this. You are not changing that the footprint of food production is just basically unsustainable on its own. There are still some things that cannot be changed. I mean, there is a lot of technologies where we still haven't found the way to make the pass to non-fossil technologies, from commercial aviation, where there are some. Let's say that we know how to power cars with electricity, we don't still really know how to power planes with electricity. So that just wouldn't work out. And for instance, fertilizing the soil is still completely depending on carbon technologies. And the thing is that the problem is not that we would make it to zero emissions. The problem is that we need to basically recover so much ground if we want to stay within the Paris model of 2 degrees, that we have to make way more radical things, or we're just running out of time. For a lot of people, the way that they look at this, and honestly, I don't know, I don't have a clear position whether it's a good idea or not. This is a race against time, because what we don't do in the next 15 years can make whatever we do after that for it to be too late. There are some changes that we would kick in the global weather systems that wouldn't be easy to solve out. So for instance, you could say, okay, things will get way better in 2070 or 2080, but then the disruption in extreme weather events will guarantee specific meters of sea level rise. So then we are a scenario where, because millions and millions of people live on the coastline, we will have to relocate everybody on the coastline, and that's obviously like a massive process that we don't really know how to engage with. Having said this, though, I don't want to live here saying like this is total doom, gloom, and apocalyptic, and we are fucked. I don't think we are. We are not in that position. There are good news. Some good news, for instance, are the fact that in spite of everything, renewables are progressing way faster than we expected. Solar is getting way cheaper, way faster than we thought. There are some possibilities of making some technologies like the food supply chain way, way more efficient than we are today. And here, for instance, where I think technology can make a lot of improvement. Still, half of the food being produced in the world goes to waste. We can optimize that system so much better, because it's just so bad currently, and I'm sure that we will optimize it.
Fuel it with non-fossil
yeah, I mean, there are projects of going back to wind-driven, and there are like a lot of projects involving on that. The problem, though, is not so much that we have to, obviously we have to reduce the impact of the maritime industry, is that also we cannot do it without reducing the amount of stuff we move around the world. So actually we have to redefine the supply chain very, very heavily, and this is where digital fabrication comes to the rescue. Yeah, and fabless take over the world, or so we want to believe. I don't think.
Well, that's our work here, no? In this place, is trying to find out ways of designing a future we want to live in, and not somehow being subjected to the drama of what we are immersed. And I think that I want to make like a two-sided question. One is like it's related that I appreciate this. It's like a wake-up call that you're doing, and probably this exhibition is a wake-up call. And the first question is related to how, we had previous wake-up calls. No, we had the Club of Rome, we have the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't happen somehow, and then we're having. Is the second? Is the third? The first question is how many wake-up calls do we need, and how many are about to come? And the second question is related with our work here is to basically invent the future that it doesn't exist yet, and make it happen somehow. Engage not only with speculate about the future, but maybe possible speculation somehow. So my question is, what happens after the end of the world?
Yeah. So, going with this last one, because I find it totally fascinating. One thing that I don't think we're aware enough of is that this thing that we call our life, all the parameters that constitute everything that we do every day, is not really some kind of natural set of laws falling from the sky. A way of living is a constructed artificial set of decisions, And many things, I am actually surprised, and I think we should all be, when we think or we become aware of how many things that we do every day in our lives are incredibly recent. Like, there is no other generation that has lived that way before. So, for instance, neoliberalism has been incredibly good and incredibly efficient at giving us access to things that no one has ever had access to. So we have taken as a given that is almost natural. For instance, we have almost taken for granted that we can eat whatever we want, no matter where we live, no matter what day of the year it is, and probably we won't need to walk more than 200 meters to get a supply of it. No matter where you are in the world, you have been given the godly right to enjoy a tomato at 11 p.m. if you want to. And that is an incredibly new development. We have never lived like that. So we don't actually need to think that is kind of like the end point or like the logical evolution to where we get there. Or, for instance, I don't know if you know that Just to give a very radical example of other ways of living are possible. Another world means another ways of living are possible. Do you know that this idea of sleeping for 7 or 8 hours all night long wasn't always like that? People used to sleep for 4 hours and then do a bunch of stuff and then sleep for 4 more hours. If even something as the sleep cycle is actually a constructed cultural artifact, almost everything can be a constructed cultural artifact. And what that means is that one of the huge necessities that we need to invent, and we creative communities have a very big responsibility here, is really to prototype and imagine new ways of living, because new ways of living are possible. Like the parameters of what we recognize as everyday life change all the time. It's just that our senses are not very good at it, you know? It's a little bit like when you see pictures from the past, pictures where you were like 10 or 12 and you see at your haircut and you're like, oh my God, that looks so stupid. How could we have those haircuts? So that actually happens with our lifestyle, you know? Like we change and then we go back and says like, this looks ridiculous. Like when you see movies from the 60s where everybody's smoking all the time and everybody's totally disgusted. So that applies to so many parameters of our daily life. So there is no drama or no tragedy in approaching this from a Puritan position of, oh my God, we have to give away so many things. We have to live in austerity and not be able to. No, we have to invent another way of living that, as any previous way of living, will be full of joy and will be full of sharing and friends and generosity. But this is a cultural exercise. And this is why I think that, of course, a technological revolution is needed, of course a political revolution is needed, but definitely a cultural revolution also will be needed. And we have to operate on all those fronts at the same time. And the first question that you made actually was about, I don't know.
If it is the last...
the last wake-up
call.
So if you go to the scientific community and you ask them, is this kind of the last chance? They say, yes, it's the last chance. But what are they going to say? Like, scientists are in this really complex paradigm, and this is almost a philosophical problem, which is, what should we tell people? We can tell people the worst case scenario, we can tell them average scenario, or we can tell them what we really think. What would you prefer? You would want probably what they really think. But the problem is that what they really think is actually based on statistical probabilities. It's like, we believe there is like between 40 and 65% of this happening. And that is really vague, because that what it means is that it may happen, it may not happen. So there's actually this kind of distance between how do you translate scientific facts into political actions that actually even almost in a way implies that it's better not to literally translate scientific fact into action, because this is probabilistic and we cannot take probabilistic political measures. We can only take certain political measures. So many scientists are pessimistic, that's true. Others are relatively pessimistic. In terms of diplomacy, if Paris collapses, we have to go back to the drawing board, and this is what happened when Kyoto collapsed in 2009. But the thing is that, honestly, making a really serious analytical exercise, when Kyoto was proclaimed in 2005, most direct effects of climate change were not that obvious or that apparent. When Paris was proclaimed in 2015, we started having, I would say, pretty definite, pretty clear, observable effects. In 2017, that things are not normal has become such a kind of overwhelming evidence that we don't even really, for the most part, stop considering it. We know it should be raining and it hasn't raining. We know that it shouldn't be in principle 20 degrees tomorrow and it's going to be close to 20 degrees. There was like this image that I saw last month, which to me was really striking. In Catalonia, there is this tradition at the beginning of the fall, early November, when it should start getting cold, of roasting almonds on the streets. So you can go to buy the first roasted almonds, because that's kind of the sign that cold is coming. So this year, as every year, in early November, people started going out in the post to roast almonds, but it was 24 degrees, and people were not really that much into roasted almonds, because actually there was quite a good number of people on the beach, 300 meters from where the roasted almonds were being sold. And what was amazing to me, it's incredible, like we're in a moment in history where the cycles of nature can change faster than the cycles of culture. And we will try to preserve the signs of a culture that represent a world that doesn't exist anymore. So this is kind of like, in a way, like you should feel privileged because we are living in a really pivotal moment in history when the transformation, we are changing geological ages. There's been very, very few humans on Earth that have lived in 2 geological ages, and we are caught right there. So we should enjoy it, if enjoying is the word. So, yeah.
One more question?
I was wondering about, I'm still trying to digest all of this, and it's really great to kind of like package it all as an impact tool, perhaps. And I was wondering, what do you think about the sense of agency and ownership of this problem? So we've seen, you're talking about using politics as a tool, and policy seems to be having a much bigger effect than the diluted sense of agency that politicians or the system is trying to dilute into consumers. And likewise, we're also having closed systems, so there's no borders in the atmosphere or in the ocean. So how do we deal with that sense of ownership, and how do we make it a problem for everyone, or a problem for those who can actually make an impact in it?
That's a very, very good question, which is very, very difficult, because actually ownership and agency, this is not my problem, there's nothing I can do about it. It's like the one number paralyzing psychological trait that we feel towards this, you know? There is, part of this problem is a problem of scale and a problem of sensing. And that is, I think, like really fascinating, which is that there are problems that cannot seem to be solved by the traditional pathways of politics because they operate on a scale that doesn't match with the scale of politics, and they operate on a scale that doesn't match with the scale of the individual. So for instance, none of us is guilty of causing climate change because all of our actions are statistically insignificant, but as members of the human species, all of us are the ones causing climate change, not the polar bears, not the jellyfish. So how do we exist in both of those parameters at the same time? And actually, it can perfectly be the case that you do everything fine, but you doing everything fine doesn't have any actual impact because it only takes for other people not to do it. So collective action in a systemic problem is obviously a very, very complicated problem. But I think part of that is, one of them is like a cognitive problem in the sense of reshaping or rephrasing our perception of what the real problems of the world are, you know, so that this in a way changes also our perception of what can we do about it. I was reading someone saying today, this is a bit of a joke, but it's not really a joke, which was something like, there are only 3 real problems in the world: male violence, inequality, and climate change. Everything would be solved if we would solve those 3 problems, you know? It's like, which is probably too optimistic, but there was like kind of a joke. But in a way, we obviously need a new political process, but we are actually in the route to try to frame how that political process would take shape. And cultural transformations are possible. If you want to think about how cultural transformations are possible and how they operate, think that some of the major, bigger fast food companies in the world are in actual financial problems because the attitudes of people towards fast food in 2017 is very different to the attitude only 10 years ago. And this was a cultural transformation that has happened very, very fast. So how do we start winning small battles that in a way produce a tipping point in terms of this is things that we're going to be doing for everybody? It's something that is going to happen. And also the set of conditions keep changing, you know? There is like a certain perception that you feel this is somebody else's problem until it's not anymore. And the pattern of extreme weather events mean that it's a question of time that it will hit us in one or a different way. So we're not going to get a hurricane, but we could get like a really, really, really tough summer if it doesn't start raining. And it better starts raining because we are not doing very well. I'm sorry. But like the next 3 months could be a bit dramatical if rain doesn't stop coming. So I am optimistic in the sense that what we are going through now, this is when I was talking about trauma, is this kind of realignment of all the factors. So I don't think our position in this conversation, our attitudes towards it are going to be the same in 5 years. And then that will definitely change how it's reflected in politics on a scale. Yeah.
So at some point in your speech you talked about a magical transformation that will have to take place in humans in order to things to change, and I'm glad you said that, because I think that's the real problem over there. Like, we are the real problem, not Trump or whoever. It's every one of us.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't see any light in general. Do you have any ideas to share about how this magical transformation could happen or could start?
So, again, like I made a very depressing presentation, so I can make a very optimistic set of answers. Cultural transformation happens every day. It's like there are so many things that we do today that we didn't do 5 years ago. So it is not so hard to create or produce an incentive for transformation. The only thing that happens is that the alignment of incentives that drives it in one specific sense and not the other needs to happen. So, for instance, now that we devote incredible amounts of energy and time to furiously checking our phones to update them, you can all remember a time when we were not doing that, because that was only 10 years ago. So actually this thing that occupies incredible amounts of our time every day, we were not doing it 10 years ago. It's as recent as that. So we can actually enforce, and we are going to be, I think, enforcing many ways or forms from paths in which we were doing that, and we're going to be able to do that. We cannot have this conversation in terms of either we do all of this or we are lost. You know, this is not something that can happen on the terrain of big final victories. It's going to happen in the level of tweaking and creating new sets of incentives and producing small cultural transformations that actually happen in every day in different ways. And again, here is where I want to make this appellation, because I think that for everybody who is in the industry of channeling behavior, and you definitely are, you have like a big responsibility. And so for how do we stimulate behavior, how we redesign behavior so that not only marketing people are working at Facebook do it, you know. Small, minimal decisions that we are taking every day are very much encouraged and defined by design decisions and by process-led decisions, and we all have a really important part to play on it.
Okay, I would say with these happy notes, final notes, we can close the lecture tonight. From tomorrow on, you can keep on talking with José Luis in the MST class.
Where is our class? It's over there, right?
In the other building, yeah.
The new building, yeah, new building. New building.
And or go to the exhibition that you're gonna love it. We have till till April, so we have time to lose it till April, so it's fine.
Sí, pero con time, en tiempo. Sí, we'll make a visit, yeah, but actually...
Okay, this is an official promise. Guided the visit at the exhibition with the curator. It's going to be nice and funny. Okay, thanks very much, José Luis de Vicente. Help me thank you. And let's have some beers with him.